A young black woman walks into a courtroom, standing alone before a powerful judge. He mocks her, believing she's just another defendant, powerless against the system. But what he doesn't know is that she's no ordinary woman. Ava Johnson is a Harvard-educated lawyer, a former military prosecutor, and a Pentagon official. And today, she's not just defending herself, she's about to expose one of the biggest judicial scandals in the country. What starts as a simple case quickly unravels into a web of corruption, hidden agendas, and a fight for justice that will shake the system to its core. Powerful men have spent years manipulating the law, silencing voices, and covering their tracks. But today, the truth is coming for them. How far does the corruption go? Who is pulling the strings from the shadows? And will Ava make it out unscathed, or has she just put a target on her back? Watch until the end to find out. And before we dive in, let us know where in the world are you watching from. Subscribe now and turn on notifications so you never miss a story that keeps you on the edge of your seat. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs as Ava Johnson stepped forward, standing tall despite the weight of 100 skeptical gazes pressing down on her. The people in the audience whispered behind their hands. To them, she was just another defendant, another case in the docket, another name on the judge's list. Seated above her on the raised bench, Judge Richard Coleman smirked. He leaned forward slightly, his gavel tapping idly against the desk. He had seen this before: young, inexperienced defendants walking in with misplaced confidence, thinking they could outsmart the system. But in his courtroom, they never did. "Miss Johnson," he drawled, eyes flicking to the paperwork in front of him. "Do you have representation, or are you here to beg for leniency?" Ava lifted her chin, her voice even. "I'll be representing myself, Your Honor." Coleman's smirk widened. "Oh, this is rich," he chuckled, shaking his head. "A self-taught lawyer. Is that it? Let me guess, a few online law courses, some episodes of Law and Order. And now you think you can handle a real courtroom?" A soft chuckle rippled through the room. Ava remained unfazed. "No, Your Honor," she said calmly. "I have a law degree. From Harvard." The room fell silent. The smirk on Coleman's face twitched, but he recovered quickly. He leaned back in his chair, giving an exaggerated sigh. "Ah, Harvard," he mused, voice dripping with mockery. "I suppose we should all be so impressed. You must have been quite the diversity pick, weren't you?" Ava arched a brow. "Actually, I graduated at the top of my class." A ripple of surprise passed through the audience. Even the court reporter glanced up briefly. Coleman, however, wasn't ready to concede anything. He laughed a dry, humorless sound. "Fascinating," he mused. "And yet, here you are, defending yourself. What happened? The big law firms didn't come knocking." Ava didn't blink. Instead, she reached into her briefcase, pulled out a neatly organized folder, and walked confidently to the defense table. "I thought we were here to discuss the case, Your Honor," she said smoothly. "Or are you more interested in making assumptions about my career?" Coleman's lips pressed into a thin line. He was used to defendants crumbling under pressure, not challenging him in return. He cleared his throat. "Fine," he said, eyes narrowing. "Proceed." Ava opened her folder and, without missing a beat, began referencing a legal precedent that Coleman himself had overlooked. As she spoke, the judge's smirk faltered. The law she cited, an obscure ruling he should have known by heart, wasn't just relevant. It was devastating to his case. A murmur swept through the spectators. Even the prosecutor shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Coleman straightened in his chair. "Where did you say you studied law again?" he asked, a forced chuckle in his voice. "Harvard," Ava repeated. "And if you'd like, I can cite a few more precedents, perhaps one of the cases you presided over." His fingers clenched around his gavel. "That won't be necessary," he muttered. A slow, knowing smile tugged at Ava's lips. She had him on edge. But she was just getting started. The air in the courtroom had shifted. It was subtle at first, just a murmur here, a glance there. But the moment Ava Johnson started citing legal precedents that Judge Richard Coleman had conveniently overlooked, the shift became undeniable. Coleman sat stiffly, his smirk long gone. He drummed his fingers against the bench, eyes narrowing at the woman standing before him. The amusement he'd felt when she first walked in had completely vanished. "You've done your homework," he admitted, forcing a casual tone. Ava didn't react to the condescension. She simply flipped another page in her file, her voice steady. "I believe it's called knowing the law, Your Honor." A few people in the gallery chuckled softly. Coleman's nostrils flared. He wasn't used to losing control of his own courtroom, much less being subtly ridiculed. "Very well," he said sharply. "Since you seem so well prepared, why don't you enlighten the court on why you believe your argument holds merit?" Ava didn't miss a beat. "Certainly," she said, stepping forward. "According to Case versus Sullivan, judicial bias is grounds for appeal, particularly when objection." The prosecutor, a middle-aged man named Edward Langley, stood up abruptly. His forehead glistened with sweat. He had been silent until now, but he clearly sensed the storm brewing. "Your Honor, is this relevant? We're here to discuss the defendant's case, not—" Ava turned to him with a disarming smile. "Mr. Langley, I'm simply establishing the legal foundation of my argument. Or would you prefer I wait until I file my appeal?" Langley opened his mouth, then hesitated. She had him cornered. Coleman cleared his throat. "Objection overruled," he muttered. "Proceed." Ava nodded in thanks, then continued, her voice ringing clear. "As I was saying, judicial bias is not only unethical, but in direct violation of constitutional rights. And in cases where a judge exhibits a pattern of prejudice, the entire record of their rulings can come into question." She let those words settle. The weight of them wasn't lost on anyone, especially not Judge Coleman. For the first time, there was real concern in his expression. His hand hovered near the gavel as if he wanted to regain control, but he didn't strike it. Ava glanced at the audience. People were watching him now, not with the usual deference, but with scrutiny, doubt. It was a rare sight, Coleman being questioned in his own courtroom. He let out a sharp breath. "Miss Johnson, let's not get carried away. You're implying a rather serious accusation." Ava met his gaze head-on. "Not implying, Your Honor. Stating." A hushed gasp rippled through the room. Even the court reporter glanced up, eyes wide. Coleman scoffed, but there was an edge to his voice now. "That's quite bold for someone in your position." Ava tilted her head. "And what position is that, Your Honor?" Coleman hesitated just for a fraction of a second, but it was enough. Ava saw it. Everyone saw it. She took a step closer to the bench. "Because if you're referring to me as a defendant, then let me remind you I'm also a Harvard-educated lawyer, a former military prosecutor, and—" She let the words hang, enjoying the moment. Coleman frowned. "And what?" The courtroom doors swung open with a loud creak. A uniformed Justice Department official strode in, his polished shoes clicking against the floor. He didn't speak at first. He didn't need to. The entire courtroom turned to look at him. He walked right past the spectators, past the lawyers, past the jury box, straight to Ava. "Miss Johnson," he said, nodding in. "Acknowledgement. It's good to see you again." A stunned silence filled the room. Ava smiled. Judge Coleman went pale. The first cracks had formed, and soon his entire foundation would collapse. The air inside the courtroom thickened with tension as the Justice Department official stood beside Ava. His presence alone shifted the atmosphere suddenly. This wasn't just a routine case. This was something bigger. Judge Richard Coleman gripped the edge of his bench, his face an unsettling mix of irritation and unease. He had controlled this courtroom for years, but now, for the first time, it was slipping from his grasp. The official Deputy Attorney General Mark Reynolds turned to face the judge, his sharp gaze unreadable. "I apologize for the interruption, Your Honor," he said, his voice crisp. "But I thought it was necessary to be present for these proceedings." Coleman forced a chuckle. "Well, Mr. Reynolds, I wasn't aware the Department of Justice had such a vested interest in a simple case like this." Reynolds didn't blink. "Oh, we do. More than you realize." The room was dead silent. Even the prosecutor, Edward Langley, looked uncertain. He cleared his throat. "Your Honor, perhaps we should take a recess," to Ava cut in smoothly. That won't be necessary. All eyes snapped back to her. She remained poised, confident. Coleman, however, wasn't about to relinquish control. He adjusted his robe, his lips curling into a forced smirk. Miss Johnson, you've certainly managed to turn this into quite the spectacle. But tell me, why is the Justice Department suddenly so interested in your case? Do you have friends in high places? Ava met his gaze, her expression unwavering. I don't need friends, Your Honor. I have credentials. She turned slightly toward Reynolds. Would you like to explain, or should I? Reynolds gave her a nod. By all means. Ava stepped forward, her voice steady, unwavering. I am not just an attorney. I am also a former military prosecutor with the Judge Advocate General's Corps. I have spent years investigating high-level corruption cases, including within the judiciary. Murmurs rippled through the audience. Coleman's smirk vanished completely. Ava continued. I am currently a senior legal advisor at the Pentagon, specializing in exposing abuses of power within the justice system. She let those words sink in. The courtroom erupted into whispers. Even Langley, who had been eager to challenge her earlier, was now shifting uncomfortably in his seat. Coleman's face darkened. He grabbed his gavel and slammed it down. Order, he barked. The murmurs died down, but the damage was already done. He had lost control of the room. Coleman's fingers drummed on the bench, his mind racing. He needed to regain the upper hand. That's all very impressive, Miss Johnson, he said, voice tight. But none of this changes the fact that you're standing here as a defendant. So, unless you'd like to continue this charade, Ava smiled. Oh, this isn't a charade, Your Honor. This is an investigation. The color drained from Coleman's face. Ava turned back to Reynolds. I assume you have the files? Without hesitation, Reynolds reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. He handed it to Ava, who took it with a knowing glance. She flipped it open and read aloud. Richard Coleman, subject of an ongoing investigation into judicial misconduct, with a documented history of racially biased rulings and suspected involvement in legal bribery scandals. Gasps filled the courtroom. Coleman's hands clenched into fists. This is ridiculous, he snapped. I am a respected judge. Ava didn't flinch. Respected by who exactly? She turned another page in the file. Your Honor, shall we discuss the case of Mr. Darnell Brooks? You sentenced him to 10 years in prison for a nonviolent offense, an offense that white defendants received probation for in your courtroom. Would you like to explain that? Coleman's jaw tightened. A man in the gallery suddenly stood up. He was middle-aged, his suit slightly worn, his face lined with hardship. His voice trembled, but it carried through the room. She's right. All eyes turned to him. My name is Darnell Brooks, the man continued. And this judge stole 10 years of my life. The room exploded. Coleman's gavel slammed against the wood, but this time no one fell silent. The courtroom wasn't his anymore. And for the first time in his career, Judge Richard Coleman was the one on trial. Judge Richard Coleman had spent years commanding silence with a single slam of his gavel. But now, the sound was hollow, lost in the growing storm of murmurs and outrage swirling through the courtroom. Darnell Brooks, the man Coleman had unjustly sentenced, stood tall in the gallery, his voice trembling but firm. You ruined my life, Brooks said, his eyes locked onto the judge. You threw me in prison over a charge that should have never carried more than probation. I lost 10 years. 10 years. I missed my daughter's childhood. My mother died while I was locked up. And you, his voice broke. You didn't even look at me when you read the sentence. The weight of his words crushed the air from the room. Ava closed the file in her hands. She didn't need to read another word. She turned back to Coleman. His face was rigid, his jaw clenched, so tight it looked like he was holding back bile. Your Honor, she said, her tone deliberate, measured, dangerous. This isn't an isolated case. It's a pattern of racial bias, unethical rulings, and judicial misconduct. The murmurs grew louder. A reporter in the gallery scribbled furiously. In a notepad, the court officers exchanged uneasy glances. Even Prosecutor Langley, who had been eager to discredit Ava, now looked like a man standing too close to a crumbling building. Coleman grabbed his gavel again, knuckles white. "Enough of this nonsense," he snapped. "This is a courtroom, not a circus." Ava tilted her head slightly, watching him unravel. "Then let's talk about the law, Your Honor. I believe the law states that any judge under investigation for misconduct should recuse himself from active cases, yet here you are, sitting on that bench, pretending this trial is legitimate." Coleman stiffened. A beat passed. Then another. Ava let the silence hang, pressing on him like a slow-building weight. Finally, Deputy Attorney General Reynolds stepped forward. "Judge Coleman," he said, his voice calm but unforgiving, "the Justice Department has been reviewing your rulings for months. And I have to say, the evidence we've gathered is concerning." Coleman scoffed, but it was a weak, brittle sound. "You can't just walk into my courtroom and threaten me," with Reynolds held up a sealed envelope. "We can. And we are." The courtroom collectively leaned forward. Coleman hesitated, his hand tightening around the gavel like it was the last thing tethering him to power. This is a baseless smear campaign," he spat. "I have 30 years of judicial service, a pristine record, and you have a history of disproportionate sentencing against black defendants," Ava interrupted. "And it ends today." Coleman's face flushed deep red. He was cornered, but he wasn't the type to go down quietly. He turned to Langley, grasping for support. "Prosecutor, are you really going to let them turn my courtroom into a spectacle?" Langley shifted uncomfortably, avoiding eye contact. Ava saw it. Everyone saw it. Coleman had spent decades intimidating prosecutors, but now even his own allies were distancing themselves. A slow realization dawned in his eyes. He was alone. Ava took a step forward, her gaze sharp as a blade. "Your Honor, I'd like to submit an official motion." Coleman's voice was hoarse. "What motion?" "A motion for your immediate recusal and an internal ethics review of every case you've presided over in the last 15 years. The gallery erupted. The court clerk's hands trembled as she reached for the motion form. She had never witnessed a sitting judge being removed from the bench mid-trial. Coleman's chest rose and fell rapidly, his mind racing for a way out. But there wasn't one. Reynolds handed the sealed envelope to the bailiff, who opened it and paled. He turned to Coleman, voice uncertain. "Your Honor, you need to step down." Coleman stared at him. "You have no right to. This is a direct order from the Department of Justice," Reynolds said coolly. "You're being placed on immediate administrative leave pending a full investigation." Silence. Dead, heavy silence. Coleman's grip on his gavel tightened. Then slowly, painfully, he set it down. His reign was over. As the bailiffs approached, Ava exhaled slowly, her shoulders relaxing for the first time that day. Justice had begun. But it wasn't over yet. Judge Richard Coleman had ruled this courtroom like a king for years, wielding his gavel like a scepter. But now, that power had been ripped from his grasp, and the humiliation of it boiled beneath his skin. He sat frozen, his fingers still hovering near the gavel, as if refusing to let go would somehow undo what had just happened. The bailiffs stood ready, waiting for him to comply with the Justice Department's order. The spectators, reporters, and attorneys in the courtroom all held their breath, watching the unthinkable unfold. Coleman's voice was a strained whisper. "This is a mistake." Ava Johnson, standing tall and composed, studied him. "No, Your Honor," she said, her voice steady. "This is accountability." The words cut deep. Coleman forced a laugh, but it was empty, hollow. "You think you've won?" He leaned forward, eyes narrowing. "You're nothing but a self-righteous little careful," Ava interrupted, her expression unreadable. "Every word you say now is being documented." Coleman's lips pressed into a thin line. For the first time in decades, he was the one being judged. Deputy Attorney General Mark Reynolds took a step forward, clearing his throat. "Judge Coleman, let's keep this professional. You are to step down immediately pending an investigation. Failure to comply will result in a formal suspension and possible criminal charges." The mention of criminal charges made Coleman's jaw clench. A flicker of something fear crossed his face. Ava watched him grapple with reality. He was a man who had spent years believing he was untouchable, only to realize in a matter of minutes that he wasn't. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Coleman pushed back his chair. The room collectively exhaled. Slowly, stiffly, he rose to his feet, his black robe billowing slightly as he moved. But the weight of disgrace hung heavier on his shoulders than the fabric ever could. He looked out at the courtroom, his courtroom, and saw nothing but judgmental eyes staring back at him. Even his longtime prosecutor, Edward Langley, refused to meet his gaze. He was alone. The realization made his hands tremble with rage. As he stepped down from the bench, one of the bailiffs extended a hand toward him, as if ready to escort him out. Coleman bristled. "I can walk," he snapped. The bailiff didn't argue. With slow, deliberate steps, Coleman moved toward the exit, his polished shoes echoing loudly in the dead-silent courtroom. And then a single clap. Then another. Then another. The audience wasn't applauding for him. They were applauding for Ava. As Coleman reached the door, he turned back, his face a mask of bitterness. His gaze locked onto Ava, and for a moment there was something ugly and dark behind his eyes. "You think you're better than me," he muttered, just loud enough for her to hear. Ava tilted her head, considering him. "No," she said. "I just refuse to be worse." The words hung in the air. Coleman gritted his teeth, then turned and disappeared through the door. The moment it closed behind him, the courtroom erupted. Reporters scrambled to file their stories. Lawyers whispered amongst themselves. The energy in the room was electric. A tyrant had fallen, and justice had finally taken its first breath. Ava let the noise wash over her. She had won, but she wasn't done. Not yet. She turned to Deputy Attorney General Reynolds. "We need to start reviewing every case he's ever ruled on," she said. "We don't just remove corrupt judges. We undo their damage." Reynolds nodded. "I was hoping you'd say that." The battle was over. But the war for justice had just begun. The echoes of Judge Richard Coleman's departure had barely faded when Ava Johnson turned to face the real battle ahead. The courtroom was still alive with murmurs, a mixture of shock, triumph, and disbelief hanging in the air. Reporters whispered into their recorders, attorneys traded glances, and spectators clung to every moment, knowing they had just witnessed history. But for Ava, the job was far from finished. She adjusted her blazer and turned to Deputy Attorney General Mark Reynolds, who was already flipping through a thick folder labeled Coleman Judicial Misconduct Inquiry. "We have work to do," Ava said firmly. Reynolds nodded. "We'll need a full team reviewing his past rulings, every wrongful conviction, every questionable sentence." He exhaled, glancing around. This isn't just about Coleman anymore. It's about the system that let him thrive. Ava's gaze darkened. She knew the truth all too well. Coleman was just one piece of a much bigger problem. As if reading her thoughts, Reynolds handed her a confidential report. "We started investigating Coleman months ago," he explained. "And we found something else." Ava took the folder, flipping through the pages. Her heart pounded as she scanned the list of names: judges, prosecutors, court officials. "This isn't just about one corrupt judge," Reynolds continued. "It's an entire network." Ava's grip on the file tightened. A web of injustice lay beneath the surface, hidden behind the facade of a fair legal system. She closed the folder sharply. "Then we don't stop with Coleman." Reynolds gave a half-smile. "I was hoping you'd say that." Across the room, Prosecutor Edward Langley shifted uneasily. He had been silent throughout the courtroom's collapse, watching his longtime ally fall. Now, the walls were closing in on him too. Ava approached him, her expression unreadable. "Prosecutor Langley," she said smoothly, "you worked alongside Coleman for years. Surely you saw something." Langley swallowed hard. I followed procedure," he stammered. "I prosecuted cases based on the evidence provided. I wasn't responsible for the sentences Coleman handed down." Ava finished for him. "No, but you didn't question them either, did you?" Langley's face paled. Reynolds folded his arms. "We're reviewing every case Coleman handled. which means we'll also be looking at the prosecutors who stood by and let it happen. Langley's breath hitched. Wait, hold on. I didn't know the extent of it, he insisted. Look, if there's anything I can do to help. Ava leaned in slightly. That depends, she said. Are you willing to help? Or are you just trying to save yourself? Langley hesitated. The weight of everything, the courtroom, the scandal, the looming investigation was crushing him. Finally, he exhaled sharply. I'll cooperate, he muttered. Whatever you need. Ava studied him for a moment, then nodded. Good. Because we're going to need every piece of information you have. The walls of corruption were beginning to crack, and Ava was going to tear them down completely. Later that evening, in the district attorney's office, stacks of case files lay open on a large conference table. Ava stood at the head, scanning the pages, seeing name after name, wrongfully convicted individuals, excessive sentences, manipulated evidence. Beside her, Reynolds sighed. How many lives did this man ruin? Ava's jaw tightened. Too many. She turned to her team. We start reviewing these cases first thing tomorrow. We're not just exposing corruption, we're setting things right. And as she looked at the files before her, she knew this was only the beginning. The next morning, Ava Johnson arrived at the district attorney's office just as the sun was breaking over the city skyline. Inside, the energy was palpable. Attorneys, investigators, and clerks moved with a sense of urgency. Judge Richard Coleman had been removed from a bench, but his shadow still loomed over the legal system. Now it was time to uncover just how deep the corruption ran. Ava walked into the conference room where stacks of case files were spread across a long table. Deputy Attorney General Mark Reynolds was already there, flipping through reports. A whiteboard stood at the head of the room, covered in names, dates, and case numbers, each one a person who might have been wrongfully convicted under Coleman's rulings. Morning, Reynolds said, not looking up from a document. Hope you're ready for a long day. Ava pulled out a chair. I've been ready for years. She grabbed the first file on the table, flipping it open. Inside was a mugshot of Deshaun Carter, a young black man who had been sentenced to 20 years for possession of marijuana, a nonviolent offense that typically resulted in probation for white defendants. Deshaun Carter, Ava read aloud. Convicted 5 years ago. The arresting officer? Detective Paul Grayson. Reynolds looked up sharply. Grayson. He pulled another file from the stack. He's tied to multiple convictions under Coleman's rulings. Ava scanned further. And look at this, the prosecutor in Carter's case was Edward Langley. The room went silent. Langley had agreed to cooperate, but Ava knew better than to trust him fully. Call Langley in, Ava said. It's time he starts answering real questions. 30 minutes later, Langley walked into the room, his usual confidence shaken. I was told you needed me, he said carefully. Ava gestured toward the stack of files. We need the truth, Langley. And you're going to give it to us. Langley hesitated. I already agreed to cooperate. Then start talking, Reynolds said. How many of Coleman's convictions were influenced by outside pressure? Langley rubbed his temples. Look, he sighed. Coleman had expectations. He pushed for harsher sentences, especially against Black and Latino defendants. He thought being tough on crime made him look strong. Ava crossed her arms. And you went along with it? Langley's jaw tightened. I didn't question it at first. But over time, I realized it wasn't just about being tough. It was targeted. Certain defendants, certain neighborhoods, it was a pattern. Ava exchanged a glance with Reynolds. They were getting closer. Reynolds slid a document across the table. What do you know about Detective Paul Grayson? Langley's face went pale. Ava narrowed her eyes. So, you do know something. Langley swallowed hard. Grayson, he was dirty. He'd fabricate evidence, coerce witnesses. I suspected it, but I never had proof. Coleman trusted him completely. Ava's stomach twisted. Did you ever prosecute a case knowing the evidence was falsified? She pressed. Langley's hands clenched into fists. Guilt flickered across his face. I don't know, he admitted. There were cases where things didn't add up, but I didn't dig deeper. I didn't want to. And now, his voice dropped. Now I have to live with that. Ava stared at him, trying to decide if there was any redemption for a man like Langley. Then prove it, she said finally. Help us overturn these convictions. Expose Grayson. Show us you're not the same man you used to be. Langley exhaled shakily. Where do we start? Ava pushed a stack of case files toward him. We start with the names on these pages, she said. Because every single one of them deserves justice. As Langley opened the first file, Ava knew the truth was finally unraveling. But the hardest part was yet to come. The weight of the files stacked high on the conference table felt heavier than paper. Each one contained a life derailed by injustice, a story of someone who had faced Judge Richard Coleman's biased rulings without a voice to defend them. Ava Johnson ran a hand over her face. The night had been long, and the morning was already pressing in. Across from her, Edward Langley sat stiffly, flipping through pages of evidence that directly implicated him. He had spent years as Coleman's go-to prosecutor, handing down excessive charges, upholding convictions based on shaky evidence, and never questioning the system that had rewarded him. Now his name was in these files too. You said you suspected Detective Paul Grayson was fabricating evidence, Ava said, breaking the silence. Now's your chance to prove it. Langley exhaled sharply. Grayson was untouchable, he muttered. He made arrests. Judges trusted him. I never saw him plant evidence myself, but I know the conviction rate in cases he handled was almost perfect. Reynolds frowned. A detective with a perfect conviction rate isn't a good cop, he's a manipulator. Langley nodded grimly. He was Coleman's favorite. Anytime we needed a case to stick, Coleman would accept Grayson's testimony without question. Ava flipped open another file. Then let's question it now. She turned the file toward them. Inside was the case of Deshaun Carter, the young man sentenced to 20 years for marijuana possession. Langley skimmed the arrest report. This doesn't make sense. His brow furrowed. Carter's record was clean before this. But according to Grayson's statement, Carter had a known history of drug trafficking. That's why the judge justified the heavier sentence. Ava pointed to the evidence log. There's no record of prior arrests. No surveillance footage. Nothing. Grayson's entire claim was based on his word alone. Langley swallowed hard. Which means Carter could have been set up. Ava nodded. And if Grayson did it once, he's done it dozens of times. Reynolds tapped a pen against the table. We need to bring him in. Langley hesitated. You don't understand, he said. Grayson isn't just some dirty cop. He's protected. If you go after him, he'll come after you. Ava leaned forward, unshaken. Then let him. Langley stared at her, seeing something unrelenting in her eyes. For years, he had worked alongside men like Grayson, men who thrived in a system built to protect them. Men who believed they were untouchable. But this time, something was different. Ava wasn't just trying to expose the truth. She was coming for them. Ava sat in her office, flipping through the growing list of names tied to Coleman's courtroom. Every single name mattered. She picked up her phone and dialed. Hello, a male voice answered. Mr. Carter, Ava said softly. This is Ava Johnson. I have some news about your case. A pause. Then, a shaky breath. Are you saying you can help me? Ava gripped the phone tighter. Not just you, she promised. Everyone. But as she hung up, her phone buzzed again, this time, an unknown number. She hesitated. Then answered. Silence. Then a low, raspy voice. You need to stop digging. Her blood ran cold. Then the call disconnected. Ava slowly set the phone down. She wasn't just facing a corrupt system anymore. She was being watched. Ava Johnson sat motionless, her phone still clutched in her hand. The weight of the unknown caller's warning pressed down on her, but she refused to let fear take root. She had spent years exposing corruption in the system. This wasn't the first time someone wanted to silence her. But it felt different this time. This wasn't just about Judge Coleman anymore. It wasn't even just about Detective Paul Grayson. Someone bigger was watching. Ava exhaled, forcing herself to stay calm. She tapped her phone screen, sending the number to a trace program she had access to through the Pentagon's cybersecurity division. If someone was trying to intimidate her, she intended to find out exactly who they were. A knock on the door made her sit up straighter. "Come in," she called. Deputy Attorney General Mark Reynolds stepped inside, his face tight with concern. "We have a problem," he said, closing the door behind him. Ava set her phone down. "Let me guess," she said. "It has to do with Paul Grayson." Reynolds nodded. "He's gone." Ava's eyes narrowed. "What do you mean gone?" "I mean," Reynolds said, his voice low, "he disappeared. The department sent officers to bring him in for questioning, but his house was empty. No sign of a struggle, no forced entry. Just gone." Ava felt a cold certainty settle in her stomach. "He knew we were coming," she murmured. Reynolds ran a hand through his hair. "And that's not all. Someone wiped his police records, his personnel file, his case history, everything. It's like he never existed." Ava stiffened. This wasn't just a dirty cop skipping town. Someone powerful was protecting him. She reached for her phone, pulling up the trace on the unknown number. The results came back within seconds, and when she saw the location, her breath caught in her throat. The call had come from inside a government building. She turned the screen toward Reynolds. "Whoever threatened me isn't some low-level thug," she said. "They have government access." Reynolds cursed under his breath. "This is bigger than we thought." Ava nodded. "We're not just dealing with Coleman's corruption anymore." She leaned forward, eyes sharp. "We're dealing with an entire cover-up." Edward Langley paced back and forth in a dimly lit parking garage, his nerves fraying by the second. He had agreed to help Ava and Reynolds, but now he was wondering if he had just signed his own death sentence. A black SUV rolled to a stop a few feet away. The tinted window rolled down, revealing a man in a dark suit. Langley's breath hitched. "Get in," the man said. Langley hesitated. "Who are you?" The man's expression didn't change. "A friend," he said. "Or an enemy, depending on how you answer my next question." Langley swallowed hard. What do you want?" The man leaned slightly forward. "We know you've been talking to Ava Johnson." Langley's blood ran cold. The man's gaze hardened. "Walk away, Langley, before it's too late." Langley's hand shook, but he forced himself to stand his ground. "And if I don't?" The man smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Then," he said calmly, "you'll find out just how much powerful people hate loose ends." The window rolled up. The SUV pulled away. Langley stood there, heart hammering, knowing one thing for certain: this wasn't just about justice anymore. This was about survival. Ava Johnson had spent her career fighting for justice, but never before had the battle felt this dangerous. Her investigation into Judge Richard Coleman's corruption had exposed a much bigger conspiracy, one that went beyond a single courtroom. A network of powerful individuals had protected Coleman, covered for Detective Paul Grayson, and erased evidence faster than she could uncover it. And now they were coming for her. Sitting in a secure briefing room at the Department of Justice, Ava reviewed the latest updates with Deputy Attorney General Mark Reynolds. Across from them, Edward Langley sat pale and shaken, the threat from the unknown operative still weighing on him. "They told me to walk away," Langley muttered. "That I was a loose end." Ava's gaze hardened. "Then we make sure we tie everything together before they can cut us off." Reynolds exhaled sharply. "We need to move fast. Grayson is gone, Coleman is under investigation, and someone inside the government is trying to erase all traces of their involvement." Ava flipped open a confidential file. "We still have something they don't." She turned the document toward Langley. His eyes widened in shock. "This," he whispered. "This is Grayson's hidden case file." Ava nodded. "Before his records were erased, I had a cybersecurity contact pull backups from classified law enforcement databases. This file proves that Grayson was never acting alone. He was part of a coordinated effort to manipulate cases." Langley swallowed hard. "But if this is real, then the people protecting him aren't just cops and judges." Reynolds' jaw tightened. "We're looking at politicians, high-ranking officials, maybe even federal agents." Ava met his gaze. "Which means we don't just expose them." Her voice was steady. "We take them down." 3 hours later, Ava, Reynolds, and a small team of trusted DOJ officials gathered in a secure location. Their plan was simple: flush out the people behind the cover-up. Using the classified files Ava recovered, they arranged for a fake leak, making it appear as if undeniable evidence against Grayson and Coleman was about to be released to the press. If the people protecting them wanted to keep their secrets buried, they would have to show their hand. Ava watched the clock. They wouldn't have to wait long. At exactly 7:42 p.m., the trap was sprung. Within minutes of the fake leak, a black SUV pulled up to a secure DOJ facility, where the fabricated evidence was supposedly being held. Ava watched from a nearby surveillance feed. A team of armed men stepped out, their movements too precise, too coordinated to be ordinary criminals. These were professionals, FBI agents. Reynolds swore under his breath. They're sending their own people to destroy the evidence. Ava didn't hesitate. She grabbed a secure line and issued the order. Go now. Within seconds, federal marshals and DOJ tactical teams swarmed the facility. The black-clad operatives barely had time to react before they were forced to surrender. One of them, a high-ranking FBI agent, was dragged out in handcuffs. Ava stepped forward, her expression cold. You should have known, she said. Justice always catches up. The next day, headlines exploded across the nation. Corrupt judge removed, national conspiracy exposed, federal agents arrested in DOJ sting, Ava Johnson. The woman who took down a corrupt system, Coleman, was officially disbarred and charged with judicial misconduct. Paul Grayson was located attempting to flee the country and arrested at the airport. Multiple high-ranking officials were under investigation, and the cases Coleman had wrongly ruled on were being reopened. As Ava sat in her office, exhausted but victorious, Reynolds walked in. It's done, he said. Coleman, Grayson, the whole network. He smiled slightly. We won. Ava nodded. For now. Reynolds raised an eyebrow. You don't think it's over? Ava leaned back in her chair. There will always be another Coleman, another Grayson, another system trying to protect itself. But now, she smiled. Now, they know we won't stop fighting. And with that, justice had truly been served. Ava Johnson stood her ground against corruption and proved that no one is above the law. But this isn't just a story, it's a reminder that justice needs people who are willing to stand up, speak out, and never back down. What do you think about this case? Have you ever seen injustice in your own community? Let us know in the comments, where in the world are you watching from? And if you want more powerful stories like this one, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a video. Justice isn't just a word, it's a fight, and it starts with you. Subscribe now and be part of the conversation.